If you're resentful about something, well, first of all, you should notice, I'm resentful. And that's kind of humiliating because no one's proud of being resentful. It's a shameful emotion. Well, so then why are you resentful? Well, there's only two reasons as far as I've been able to tell. One is that you're allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, or you're being taken advantage of. Sometimes you're not allowing yourself. Sometimes you're a child being abused by their uncle. You're not allowing yourself. You can't do anything about it. You're resentful because you're being taken advantage of or because you're immature. It's one of those two things. Figure out which it is and then take the steps necessary to address it. Living a life without resentment is a great goal. People are often resentful if they see that responsibility has been abdicated. Why isn't that person doing their job? It's like, well, hey man, step in at your workplace, in your family. You know, and you think, well, I shouldn't have to do that extra work. Well, you shouldn't be a slave. You shouldn't allow yourself to be tyrannized. But if something bugs you because a responsibility is going unfulfilled, there's a great opportunity for you. And this is something I don't think we teach young people well. And one of the things, you may remember this, that was so striking about the tour was that I made a case fairly consistently that most people find the meaning that sustains them through the vicissitudes of life, not in happiness, but in responsibility. And that would bring everyone to a halt. It would always make the whole theater silent. It's like, oh, I never thought of that connection. Because maybe you want to avoid responsibility, and you can understand why. You can understand why. You hide from it. That is what you encounter if you go out in the world. You think, who the hell wants that? I don't want the responsibility. It's like, well, yes, you do, as it turns out. There's nothing better than responsibility. Now, you know, I say that with some caution. I think that it's hard to say. The responsibility, I've been overwhelmed by my apparent responsibility, but I think it's also kept me alive. And I mean that literally. And so,
wait, can you go a little deeper with that? I mean, when you were at your darkest moments in the last 2 years, whatever that might be, was it the feeling of the...
many times in the last year where it would have been much easier for me just to be dead. That's constant. So, but no.
But is it but no because of something in you, or is it but no because of the people that you would have abdicated that responsibility of the people, or is that ultimately the same thing?
It.
Yeah.
Well, I do think the two aren't easily distinguishable, but it's definitely that. It's definitely that. You know. And it's one of the chapters. The last chapter is be grateful in spite of your suffering. You know, you need a meaning to sustain you through suffering, and it is the case that you find that in responsibility. Well. And so it's good advice for anyone who's at work. You're resentful about this and that because people aren't pulling their weight. Pull it. See what happens. You become indispensable instantly. You'll know everything. And maybe that job won't be for you, or maybe that relationship won't be for you, but you'll take your hard acquired wisdom and go elsewhere and flourish there. So, you know, this kid stopped me. I think I wrote about this in this book. Kid stopped me in a restaurant one day when I was walking in, and he said, and he had an undergraduate degree, and he was working as a waiter in a chain steak place. And he stopped me and he said, you know, about 6 months ago, I was watching one of your lectures, and I decided to stop being resentful about my job. And he was resentful because he had a university degree and he was working as a waiter. You know, and look, I don't have anything against waiters. It's like a waiter can make your evening, you know, hooray. He said, well, I decided I'd start trying at my job, like really trying as if it was worthwhile. He said he got 3 promotions in 6 months, like he's just rocketing up the power hierarchy. Well, it's not power, it's competence if it's well run. You know, and places are full of opportunity. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you. And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving. Right. And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of it on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you, and you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger. And then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know. And soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. There's this old story in King Arthur where the knights go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is either the cup that Christ drank out of at the Last Supper, or the cup into which the blood that gushed from his side was poured when he was crucified. The stories vary, but it's basically a holy object, like the phoenix in some sense, that's a representation of transformation. So it's an ideal. And so King Arthur's knights, who sit at a round table because they're all roughly equal, go off to find the most valuable thing. And where do you look for the most valuable thing when you don't know where it is? Well, each of the knights looks at the forest surrounding the castle and enters the forest at the point that looks darkest to him.
And that's a good thing to understand, because the gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. And so, and that's why there's, you know, an idiosyncratic element of it for everyone. Your particular place of enlightenment and terror is not going to be the same as yours, except that they're both places of enlightenment and terror. So they're equivalent at one level of analysis and different at another. So anyways, back to fiction and what it does. It distills truth, and it produces characters that are composites. And the more they become composites, the more they approximate a mythological character. And so they become more and more universally true and more approximating religious deities. But the problem with that is they become more and more distant from individual experience. And so with literature, there's this very tight line where you need to make the character more than merely human, but not so much of a god that, you know, one of the things that happened to Superman in the 1980s, Superman started out, he's got a heavenly set of parents, by the way, and an earthly set of parents, and he's an orphan like Harry Potter. Very common theme is that when Superman first emerged, he could only jump over buildings, you know, and maybe he could stop a locomotive. But by the time the 1980s rolled around, like, he could juggle planets and, you know, swallow hydrogen bombs, and, you know, he could do anything. Well, people stopped buying the Superman comics because how interesting is that? It's like something horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And something else horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And it's like, that's dull. He turned into such an archetype. He was basically the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God, and that's no fun. It's like God wins, and then God wins again, and then again God wins, and, you know, so then they had to weaken him in different ways with kryptonite, you know. So green kryptonite kind of made him sick, and red kryptonite, I think, kind of mutated him, if I remember correctly. And anyways, they had to introduce flaws into his character so that there could be some damn plot. And that's something to think about, you know. There's a deep existential lesson in that your being is limited and flawed and fragile. You're like the genie, which is genius in the little tiny lamp, you know, this immense potential, but constrained in this tiny little living space, as Robin Williams said when he played the genie in Aladdin. But the fact that you have limitations means that the plot of your life is the overcoming of those limitations, and that if you didn't have limitations, well, there wouldn't be a plot, and maybe there would be no life. And so that's part of the reason why perhaps you have to accept the fact that you're flawed and insufficient, and live with it and consider it a precondition for being. It's at least a reasonable idea. So anyways, one of the main characters is the country, the known, the explored territory. We went over that a bit, and it always has two elements. I mean, your country is your greatest friend and your worst enemy, you know, because it squashes you into conformity and demands that you act in a certain manner, and reduces your individuality to that element that's tolerated by everyone else, and it constrains your potential in a single direction. And so it's really tyrannical, but at the same time it provides you with a place to be and all of the benefits that have accrued as a result of the actions of your ancestors and all the other people that you're associated with. So there's the good tyrant, or the bad tyrant, and the good king, and those are archetypal figures, and that's because they're always true, and they're always true simultaneously, you know, which is partly why I object to the notion of the patriarchy, because it's a it's the what do you call that? It's the apprehension of a mythological trope, which is that of the evil tyrant, without any appreciation for the fact that the archetype actually has two parts, and the other part is the wise king. And you know, you can tell an evil tyrant story about culture, no problem, but it's one-sided, and that's very dangerous, because you don't want to forget all the good things that you have while you're criticizing all the ways that things are in error. That's a lack of gratitude, and it's a lack of wisdom, and it's founded in resentment, and it's very dangerous, both personally and socially. I told you that Captain Hook is a tyrant because he's got this crocodile chasing him, and the crocodile has a clock in its stomach, and that's death. It's like, obviously, right? Tick, 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 tick. And it's a crocodile, and it's under the water, and it's already got a taste of him, so he's being chased around by death, and that makes him terrified and resentful and cruel and bitter, and so he's a tyrant. And he wants to wreak havoc everywhere. And then Peter Pan, of course, looks at Captain Hook and thinks, why the hell should I grow up and to be a tyrant and sacrifice all the potential of childhood? And the answer to that is, the potential sacrifices itself if you don't utilize it as you mature, and you just end up a 40-year-old lost boy, which is a horrifying thing to behold. It's almost as if you're the corpse of a child, the living corpse of a child, because who the hell wants a 6-year-old, 40-year-old? You're a little on the stale side by that point, and not the world's happiest individual. So, you know, your potential is going to disappear because you age anyways, and so you might as well shape that potential in a particular direction and at least become something, no matter how limited, rather than nothing. So, you know, Peter Pan, that's a great story. It's a great mythological story. So, well, so let's talk about tyrants. Well, not only are they mythological figures, but they exist, and they tend to be deified. I mean, Stalin was, for all intents and purposes, God the Father in Soviet Russia, although he was pretty much only the worst elements of Old Testament God, who was, you know, constantly smiting people and wiping out populations and doing all sorts of things that seemed to be quite nasty. But nonetheless, you know, people worshipped him in many ways, and he's a representation of just exactly what goes wrong when things really go wrong, when people stop paying attention and when they all lie. Because one of the things that characterized the communist state was that no one ever got to say anything they actually believed, ever. And that was partly because 1 out of 3 people was an informer, which meant if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of them were informing on the government about you, and that included your own children. And if you were an informer, you were often amply rewarded by the state, so that if you lived in an overcrowded apartment building with 3 families in the same flat, and you informed on, you know, the woman down the hall that you didn't like, she got shipped off to the old concentration camp, and you got her apartment. And so that was a lovely society, and it only killed about 30 million people between 1919 and 1959. So that's what happens when the archetypal structure gets tilted badly, when people forget that they have a responsibility to fulfill as citizens, as awake citizens who are capable of stating the truth, and the archetype shifts, so there's nothing left of the great father except the tyrant. And let's not have that happen. I mean, the one on the right is really interesting, because consciously or unconsciously, you know, there's Stalin surrounded by what is, for all intents and purposes, fire. You know, he looks like Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty when she shows up at Aurora's christening. You know, she puts her arms up in the air and green fire surrounds her. It's like he's surrounded by fire, and there's Lenin above him, who's like king of the fiery realm, and that's for sure. So, I mean, all the terrors that happened in the Soviet Union didn't start under Stalin, they started under Lenin, and Stalin was definitely Lenin's legitimate son, let's put it that way.
So as men move into their careers, how might responsibility and purpose be conceptualized? Well, look, so I always start from the fundamental observation that life is characterized by a fair bit of suffering. There's a tragic element to life. tragedy tainted by malevolence. And what that poses a problem, and the problem is, well, what can sustain you through suffering and tragedy, betrayal and illness, death, loss, disappointment, frustration, confusion. And it's not hedonism. It's not happiness, not if you conceptualize happiness in this narrowly pleasure-seeking hedonic way. First of all, that doesn't iterate very well. You know, you can drink 26 of vodka one night, and that might be a pretty fun night, but you know the next 2 or 3 days are not going to be so pleasant, and you'll probably do at least 5 things that you seriously regret, assuming you can remember what they are. So it's not a great strategy, and everyone knows that you know, that casual, impulsive pleasure-seeking is not, it's not a good game. Everyone knows that. And that doesn't mean you should be afraid to try it, right? That's entirely different. You need to bash yourself around a bit. What did William Blake say? Wisdom through excess. There's definitely something to that. So, you know, walling yourself away from experimentation, that's not a good idea. But falling prey to indulgences, that's a catastrophe. So you can't find, and then if your life is proceeding in a direction that's painful and tragic for reasons that might be really out of your control, obviously you're not going to be happy during those times. You may not have even the opportunity to seek anything that's pleasurable or the ability to experience it. So then what's going to sustain you under those circumstances and sustain your will to live, but even more importantly, protect you from the resentment and the moral corruption that unrequited suffering can so easily produce? And the answer to that is not happiness, but something like meaning. And then you might ask yourself, well, where is meaning to be found? And the answer seems to be primarily through the voluntary adoption of responsibility. You know, so people find meaning in the love they have for their partner and their decision to care for someone else as well or better than they would care for themselves. They find meaning in that, and it can sustain itself across many, many decades, for better or for worse. That's no joke, that phrase. They find meaning in the relationship they establish with their children, assuming they take the responsibility for that relationship. They find meaning in their friendships. They find meaning in their business associations, their civic engagement. You know, people moralize at, older people moralize at younger people and say, well, you should accept your responsibility, you should shoulder your duty. And that's true, but it isn't exactly that you should do it because you should do it, even though you should. It's that there isn't anything better that you can possibly do. Like, you have to justify yourself to yourself. You have to justify yourself to yourself because of your inadequacies and your failure and your error and your propensity to repeat errors that you know you shouldn't repeat, your sinful nature. You have to atone for that. And then you have to justify your life to yourself because it's characterized by death and suffering. And so you need something worthwhile to do. And, well, then you might say, well, there's nothing worthwhile to do. It's, well, you're probably not really in any position to make that judgment, you know, till you've gone all in at least one thing. At least one thing. Because, like, who the hell are you? You're 16, you're cynical and nihilistic. It's like, you're not wise. You're not a philosopher. You don't know anything. And thank God, right? Because you don't even want to think you know anything because you're bloody miserable and you're suffering. And so if you're also right, well, then you're doomed. So you better bloody well pray that your cynicism and nihilism, unearned though it may be, is based on a fundamental falsehood. And it is. You can find deep significance in your life, and you find it essentially through the decision to voluntarily bear your suffering and to trudge uphill nonetheless. And there's something heroic about that in the most fundamental sense. And that heroism is something so deeply meaningful that it, in some sense, triumphs over even death. And so as you move forward through life, you mature, you start by developing responsibility for yourself, your friends, your roommates, then you take on a partner, and you have a family, and you expand the domain of responsibility, and generosity and you want to expand that, who knows how much you can expand that? You know, you could be a credit to the nation. Well, there's an aim. Why don't you aim to be like credit to the nation by the time you're 50? Because what, you got something better to do than that? And the answer to that's no. And you know, what are you going to do? You're going to pursue endless one-night stands. You're going to bury yourself nose deep in cocaine. You're going to become an alcoholic. You're going to pursue that tinsely, trashy hedonism that is nothing but destructive and generates nothing but self-contempt, and then bitterness, then misery, then vengefulness. It's like, that's why do that? I mean, it's easier in some sense, right? Although it's not, because it's rife with catastrophe and suffering. So it's way better to take on, to envision yourself as, that's the cross image fundamentally, right? The pathway to redemption is to bear your cross up the hill voluntarily. It's a hell of a thing to ask, right? Because you have to accept the fundamental limits of your mortal vulnerability. And you have to say to yourself, I will do good nonetheless. Right? And that's not obedience. That's not naivete. That's a cold decision, man. So everyone great makes that decision. So make that decision, because maybe you're great.
You know, if you take people, and I told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things, and I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing. We have no idea how fast we can multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourself. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now, and it's because you're young. Wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient. 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time. Not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough, but you go ahead and do it anyways, and then of course exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident, because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing too is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe, and that's a very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live, you have a real life, and it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least, over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. Now when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer, yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic, all my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out, and the price you pay is some meaningless suffering. But you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr. So that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends, because that's what happened in the 20th century. If you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile. I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example, there's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different, and you need to know this because people are often stunned. For example, they finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month, and often instead they're actually depressed, and they think, oh, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in, and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion.
in the future authoring program, which is the one we've done the most research on, so if people do this for 90 minutes badly before they go to college, it'll decrease the probability they'll drop out in the first year by 50%.
That's amazing.
And it works particularly well for people who are most likely to drop out. So a lot of psychological interventions help the good performers do even better and don't help the bad performers that much.
And why do you think it helps them more?
Well, I think the good performers already have a bit of a vision and a plan, whereas the bad performers, they're really ambivalent about what they're doing because they don't have a plan. And we'll talk more about why this is so important. So if you don't have a reason to do something, and then a reason not to do it comes up, well, then you just not do it, because not doing things is real easy. You could just sit there and not do things all day. Doing things takes effort, and so any resistance is likely to, it pushes back against you. And so going to college, it's like, well, why is that difficult? Well, you have to get up, you have to go to your classes, you have to do the assignments, you have to do the reading, you have to write the tests, you have to believe that this path is somehow better than any other path you could be on, and there's innumerable other paths, and that it's better in some fundamental sense than just doing nothing or playing games or being purely hedonic. So there's a lot of, because it's difficult, there's a lot of obstacles. And if you don't have a reason, well, why would you overcome the obstacles? And so what happens when you do the future authoring program is two things. Is first of all, you construe yourself as the sort of person who could have a reason, right? Who could make a vision and impose it on the world.
And how do you do that?
Well, and then second, you actually develop a vision. Okay, so the first thing the program asks you to do, and it's got a biblical element to it in some fundamental sense, although that wasn't so explicit when we first developed it, but I came to realize that later. There's a statement in the Gospels. Christ says to his followers, ask and you'll receive. Knock and the door will open. Seek and you'll find. And you listen to that and you think, no way, man, it can't be that easy. Well, it's that easy. Because let's think about what wanting means. You want something. You want to find, so you'll seek. How hard are you going to seek? You know, maybe you're after the Holy Grail, right? Or you're after the gold in the dragon's lair, or the jewel in the toad's head. You're after something that's guarded by some monstrous figure. You're going to seek? How committed to that are you? And there's a total commitment in that in a fundamental way. Is like you should be humble enough to be open to learning, to radical transformation, to the probability that you're really wrong if you're not finding what you're seeking, and the willingness to sacrifice virtually everything of lesser value for that goal. Otherwise, you do not want it. You did not ask. You are not seeking. You did not knock on the door. Well, this is the development of a vision. Now, you can construe consciousness as the implementer of the vision in the broadest sense. So what we really confront as human beings isn't a deterministic world that runs like clockwork, that the past pushes forward in an algorithmic or deterministic manner. That isn't how the world works. The way the world works is that we confront a horizon of possibility that's not predictable. It's somewhat predictable the way a musical piece is predictable. So it's rule governed, but it's not predictable in a deterministic way. And it's full of possibility and potential. That's actually its nature. It's potential in its nature. And to maximize the quality of our interaction with that potential, we have to impose a vision on it and then pursue the vision. And so when you do the future authoring program, well, that's what you're trying to do, is develop a vision. So here's the first exercise. It's like, okay, here's the deal, all right? You get to have what you need and what you want. Maybe even better, you get to have what you need and want if you were treating yourself properly. So imagine, first of all, that you were treating yourself properly because you actually cared for yourself.
Okay, and say you don't.
Yeah, well, you don't.
How do you help somebody?
Well, you at least ask them to open the door to the possibility that maybe they could. So just imagine that you did. Not that you are, that you could, but that you tried. Think, okay, I'm a valuable person, maybe. And if I was treating myself like I had intrinsic value, like if you were treating yourself like you were someone you loved, so you could imagine doing this for someone you actually cared about. Because most people care about someone that isn't them.
So do you identify someone you care about?
Well, you can, yes, you can say, because it does tell you. It's like, well, if you're not so good at caring for yourself, imagine someone you love and then pretend that you're bringing that attitude to bear on you with all your faults and inadequacies. I'm not being casual about this. It's hard for people to do this, right? Because we know our own flaws so deeply. It's hard for us to take care of ourselves. But imagine that you should take care of yourself and that you could and that you did. Just imagine that. So that's opening up at least the door, right?
Yeah.
And then you say, well, 5 years down the road, you get to have what you want and need. What is it? And so this is a deep question. So, because the question is this: your life is going to be difficult, and it's going to be marked by suffering and tragedy in all sorts of different ways. Disappointment and obstacle and betrayal and the whole panoply of human catastrophe. That's absolutely 100% definitely coming your way. Okay, so given that, and given that you want to live a life free of resentment and bitterness and premature aging and excess suffering, and that you don't want to be a burden to everyone around you, what would you have to make carrying that weight worthwhile? That's a hard question, you know. It's like, what justifies your suffering? That isn't how am I going to be happy. It's what justifies your suffering. Well, ask yourself. You get to have what you want. If you were taking care of yourself, what would it be? Okay, and so you write for 15 minutes about what your life might be like 5 years down the road if you got to have what you needed and wanted. And then we concretize it. You know, I had lots of clients and students who said, well, I don't know what to do with my life. What should I do with my life? And the first answer to that question is, that's not a very good question. Because it's like, what, do you want a one-line answer to what you should do with your life? Like, life is everything, and you want a one-line answer to everything. No. Bad question. You can imagine a desirable future, but it helps to particularize it. So one of the things you might ask is, where do people find meaning? And the answer is, well, in multiple places. Here's some places people typically find meaning. So if clients came to me and they were depressed, first of all, I'd try to find out, are you depressed? Or do you just have a terrible life, or some combination of those two? And you might ask, what's the difference? And that's a really good question. If you're depressed, you have a good life, but you're suffering. So what would it mean that you have a good life? Well, it means somewhat different things to different people, but you can kind of triangulate on it. Probably you have an intimate relationship, or at least you have the prospects of one. So at least you want one, and you believe that maybe you could have one if you don't have one, and probably if you have a good life, you have one. You have some friends. They're real friends, right? You have some family members, children perhaps, if not children, parents and siblings, or perhaps both, grandchildren. You're nested inside a family, and your relationships with your family are desirable. You have a job or a career, and so if it's a job, well, then it's hard, and maybe you wouldn't have picked it as a vocation, but at least maybe you have good relationships with your coworkers, and you're doing something difficult, but that's actually socially productive and useful and generates an income. So that's not nothing. You're educated to the level of your intellectual capability, or you have plans to do so. You're taking care of yourself mentally and physically, and you have a strategy for dealing with the realm of signal temptation, drug and alcohol abuse and sexual misbehavior and that sort of thing. And then we've added one more recently, at least conceptually, that you've adopted a certain degree of civic responsibility, right? You're participating in the broader community in some manner. And if you're doing none of those, my life is meaningless. Are you doing any of these? No. Well, that's why it's meaningless. Those are the domains of meaning. And so, if you're miserable and you have none of those things, the first thing to do, if you're a cognitive behavioral therapist with someone, is to say, well, how about we work on like one of these things to begin with? You know, you need some friends. You need to get out in the dating market. You need a job or a better job. You need an educational plan. Like, you don't have a life, so of course you're miserable, because without sustaining life, without sustaining meaning, life is just tragedy. And so your lot is misery. And so anyways, we ask people to go through these 8 different domains and say, okay, you can have what you want, but you have to aim at it. Sin means to miss the mark, by the way. It means to miss the target. That's what takes you away from God, is to miss the target. What target? Yeah, right. What target? Right. You got to at least know there's a target, then you got to try to hit it. You know, and maybe you don't even know where the target is, but your aim isn't good, but at least you've set up a target now, and you can practice. And so, well, if you had an intimate relationship, what would it look like? If you had some friends, how would you like those friendships to be conducted? If you had a job or a career, what could it be if you had what you wanted?
Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And you know, a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was, it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face.
It's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Competent and dangerous?
Mm-hmm.
Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak. They're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process. And you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous.
That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. But the meek isn't well translated. It means something more like those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order. And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. It's like, that's a very bad idea. It's a very bad idea. Because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life. You can't bear any responsibility. You'll end up bitter. And when you get bitter, then you get dangerous.
But one thing I'm not getting, there's a big difference between letting people do something for themselves and saying men should be dangerous. By dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody.
No, you should be capable of it. But that doesn't mean you should use it. There's nothing to you otherwise. Like if you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well, right? If you learn a martial art, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Both of those come together. And the combination of that capacity for danger and the capacity for control is what brings about the virtue. Otherwise you confuse weakness with moral virtue. I'm harmless, therefore I'm good. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. That isn't how it works at all. If you're harmless, you're just weak. And if you're weak, you're not going to be good. You can't be, because it takes strength to be good. It's very difficult to be good. People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure, because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. But you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So, number one, specify your damn goals. Because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. You would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great, and you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. So that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is to plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. But, my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with. And you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people, because they don't like themselves very much. They're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. What you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, would have I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. Someone who is incapable of cruelty is a higher moral being than someone who is capable of cruelty. And I would say, and this follows Jung as well, that that's incorrect, and it's dangerously incorrect, because if you are not capable of cruelty, you are absolutely a victim to anyone who is. And so part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. But if you happen to have to get in one, and I guess the philosophy also is that if you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence, and with any luck, and this is certainly the case with bullies, with any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace. And that's partly why Jung believed that it was necessary for people to integrate their shadow. And he said that was a terrible thing for people to attempt, because the human shadow, which is all those things about yourself that you don't want to realize, reaches all the way to hell. And what he meant by that was it's through an analysis of your own shadow that you can come to understand why other people are capable, and you as well, of the sorts of terrible atrocities that characterized, let's say, the 20th century. And without that understanding, there's no possibility of bringing it under control. When you study Nazi Germany, for example, or you study the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, and you're asking yourself, well, what are these perpetrators like? Forget about the victims, let's talk about the perpetrators. The answer is, they're just like you. And if you don't know that, that just means that you don't know anything about people, including yourself. And then it also means that you have to discover why they're just like you. And believe me, that's no picnic. So that's enough to traumatize people, and that's partly why they don't do it. And it's also partly why the path to enlightenment and wisdom is seldom trod upon, because if it was all a matter of following your bliss and doing what made you happy, then everyone in the world would be a paragon of wisdom. But it's not that at all. It's a matter of facing the thing you least want to face. When my clients first come to see me, one of the things I often ask them is, okay, well, let's say you look a year ahead. What do you want? What are we aiming at? What would your life isn't the way you want it to be. How would it look if it was the way you wanted it to be, or at least partly that way? Then we aim at that, right? And we look for impediments, psychological impediments, fears, avoidance strategies, that sort of thing, and we develop strategies, and we try to move towards that, I would say, ideal. All right, to understand the categories of myth, we'll say, we have to understand something about the nature of categorization. Now, categorization is a tricky thing, and we're going to run through some complicated ideas relatively quickly. You know, you think you put things in the same category because they're similar, but the problem is that, first of all, that's not an answer. It's just a restatement of the initial proposition. And second of all, you can put things in the same category that are by no means identical, and you often do that. And third, it's things that are similar are often also importantly different. And so picking which element of similarity, you know, like let's say you have a group of books. Well, are they the same? Well, obviously no, because, well, unless they're, you know, all the same book. But the category of books is a pretty strange category because the content of the books differs completely. Well, you could still make a group of books, and you pick some arbitrary element that unites them and consider that grounds to make a category. There's other categories, more scientific categories, and scientific categories tend to actually contain things that are very, very similar across multiple dimensions. Like protons are like that. As far as I can tell, there's nothing that distinguishes one proton from another, and the same with electrons. And you know, the set of triangles is like that because you can define it precisely. But most of the categories that human beings use aren't so neat, and the problem with that is that unless the categories are neat, like scientific categories, it's very difficult to investigate them scientifically. So for example, you might do research on a group of people with anxiety disorders, but the problem with that is that the anxiety disorder category is so heterogeneous that it's almost impossible to identify the commonalities across all the people who are in that category, and that's partly because the category isn't actually a scientific category. It's a hybrid category. It's a practical category. I can give you an example of that. No, I can't, because I must not have saved it. Anyways, many of the DSM categories, so these are categories for psychopathology, require, if you're part of that category, imagine there's 7 symptoms that you could have, or 8 symptoms that you could have that would put you in that category, like antisocial personality. 8 symptoms: you steal, you kick, you hit, you bite, you know, you're abusive. I don't remember the categories precisely, but you can be in the category if you have symptoms 2 through 5, and you can be in the category if you have symptoms 6 through 8. They aren't the same symptoms, but you're in the same category. And you think, well, how the hell can that be? Well, that's a family resemblance category, roughly speaking, and lots of the things that we use are family resemblance categories. There's a prototype, and then if you have enough of the features of that prototype, imagine the prototype has 10 features, and if you have 6 of those features, you get to be in that category. But it means that the category is actually quite diverse, and that's one of the problems that plagues psychiatry as a science and clinical psychology as a science. It's a really big problem, because if the categories aren't homogeneous, then it's very difficult to draw conclusions about the members of the category. And the psychologists and the psychiatrists claim that those are scientific categories, but they're not, and they can't be, partly because they're aimed at the classification of health or ideal versus non-health or non-ideal, and partly because they play multiple roles, eh? I mean, the category isn't there just to provide neat demarcations for scientific study. The category is there to give people a language to talk about certain sets of symptoms, to diagnose, because, you know, when you come in and you have a set of symptoms, you might want to know what they are, so that you also know what they aren't. It's really a relief often to find a diagnosis. And then of course the diagnosis has certain implications for treatment and for billing and for all of that, so the category has to play all of those roles. So there's multiple types of category, and the categories that we're talking about in relationship to mythology aren't scientific categories. They're categories about the world construed as a place to act. So here's a way to think about it. You're always looking at the world through a framework of reference, and you have to do that because there isn't very much of you. You can't see the whole world at once, and in fact the amount of the world you actually see is so small you can't believe it. The central part of your vision is zipping around, producing a pretty high resolution representation of exactly what you're looking at, but outside of that center, like if I look at you, I can't see her eyes. I can see her glasses, but barely. I can't even tell whether you're male or female. The person past that, I can't see at all. Now you don't notice that, you know. You don't notice that you're that blind because your central vision is always popping around, illuminating that tiny space. But you're so damn blind, it's just mind-boggling. And I'm sure some of you have seen the Invisible Gorilla video, you know, where a gorilla comes into the video and you don't notice, which is somewhat shocking because you would think that you would notice a gorilla. But what happens is that you actually don't notice something unless it interferes with what you're doing. And because what are you going to do? Notice everything? You can't do that. You can hardly notice anything. So what you do is you pick something to focus on. It's usually something that you value, because why else would you focus on it? So that means that your value system determines the direction of your perception. Bloody well think about that for a minute. That's a Buddhist idea, right? People live in a kind of illusion, and sometimes that illusion causes suffering, and they can transform the way they look at the world, and that can release them from their suffering. But the idea that you do live in an illusion, well, I don't know if it's exactly an illusion, but you certainly do live within a framework of perception that's determined by your values. Now that is so weird, you know, because we never think of the world as something that reveals itself through our values. But of course it does, because you look at what you want. You aim at what you want, and once you've aimed, the world lays itself out for you, and that's exactly how perception works. That's why I represented it this way. You're always somewhere, that's point A, and that's somewhere in some place in some time, and you always have some notion about what you want to have happen next. You know, you're going to go to the next class maybe, you've got a plan after this. In this class you have a plan, you're hoping to learn something, I presume, and maybe you have a goal with regards to a grade, and that's nested inside your desire to get a degree, and that's nested inside your desire to be educated and to have a career and have a successful life. So attending to me at the moment, the reason you're doing that is because all of those values exist within you simultaneously, focusing your attention. And so you're attending to me and not to something else, assuming that all of you with your computers open aren't surfing the web, which you might be, but assuming that you're focusing, whatever you're focusing on is directed by what you value. And some of that can be unconscious. In fact, a lot of it is unconscious, because you know it's very difficult for you to get control of what you pay attention to. You know what that's like. You're trying to study, it's kind of a boring paper. Christ, your attention is just like everywhere, you know. Maybe you'll vacuum under the bed instead of doing the reading the paper, you know. You can't get a grip on that thing, so your attention has an autonomy. And that's another psychoanalytic idea, you know, because you kind of think, well, you're in control. It's like, really? You ever try telling yourself what to do? How does that work for you? I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week. Right, sure you are. Yeah, I'm going to quit eating sugar for a month. It's like, how long does that last? It's like 15 minutes, and you're eating like 3 chocolate bars. So, you know, one way of conceptualizing yourself is that you're one speck of dust among 7 billion. And when you conceptualize yourself that way, you might think, well, what difference does it make what I say or do? And that's actually quite convenient for you, because if it doesn't matter what you say or do, then you don't have any responsibility and you can do whatever you want. The price you pay for that is a bit of nihilism, but if you don't have to shoulder any responsibility, that's a small price to pay. That's the underground motivation for nihilism. But the other way of looking at it, and this is actually the accurate way of looking at it, is that you're in a network. You're a node in a network, and so you can do a little bit of arithmetic very rapidly and just figure out how powerful you are. You know 1,000 people. You're going to know more than that over the course of your life, but let's say 1,000 for the sake of argument for now. They know 1,000 people. That means that you're 1 person away from 1,000,000 people and 2 persons away from 1,000,000,000 people. And you're the center of that network. And now the way networks work is that information propagates in a networked manner. So don't underestimate the power of your speech. Now, you know, Western culture is phallogocentric. Let's say it. Okay, so we'll say, yeah, that's just fine. That's exactly what it is. It's predicated on the idea of the logos, that the logos is the sacred element of Western culture. And what does that mean? It means that your capacity for speech is divine. It's the thing that generates order from chaos and then sometimes turns pathological order into chaos when it has to. Don't underestimate the power of truth. There's nothing more powerful. Now, in order to speak what you might regard as the truth, you have to let go of the outcome. You have to think, all right, I'm going to say what I think, stupid as I am, biased as I am, ignorant as I am. I'm going to state what I think as clearly as I can, and I'm going to live with the consequences no matter what they are. Now, the reason you think that, that's an element of faith. The idea is that nothing brings a better world into being than the stated truth. Now, you might have to pay a price for that, but that's fine. You're going to pay a price for every bloody thing you do and everything you don't do. You don't get to choose to not pay a price. You get to choose which poison you're going to take. That's it. So if you're going to stand up for something, stand up for your truth. It'll shape you, because people will respond and object and tell you why you're a fool and a biased moron and why you're ignorant. And then if you listen to them, you'll be just that much less like that the next time you say something. And if you do that for 5 years, you'll be so damn tough and articulate and able to communicate and withstand pressure that you won't even recognize yourself. And then you'll be a force to contend with. And you don't get to wait until, because I get letters like Sad gets all the time too, from faculty members in particular, and they say, well, you know, when I get tenure, it's like, then they think, well, when I'm an associate professor, and then they think, well, when I'm a full professor. It's like, if you're a professor already, you're like the most protected person in the history of the planet, you know, and you need, well, okay, but one of the things that indicates is that it's almost impossible to provide people with enough protection so that they feel safe to speak. Okay, so we'll address that directly. It is not safe to speak, and it never will be. But the thing you got to keep in mind is that it's even less safe not to speak. Right? It's a balance of risks. It's like you want to pay the price for being who you are and stating your mode of being in the world, or do you want to pay the price for being a bloody serf, one that's enslaved him or herself? Well, that's a major price, man. That thing unfolds over decades, and you'll just be a
miserable worm at the end of about 20 years of that, right? No self-respect, no power, no ability to voice your opinions, nothing left but resentment because everyone's against you, because of course you've never stood up for yourself. It's like, say what you think carefully, pay attention to your words. The price is, it's a price you want to pay if you are willing to believe that truth is the cornerstone of society. And in the most real sense, if you're willing to take that leap, then tell the truth and see what happens. And nothing better could possibly happen to you. There'll be ups and downs, and there'll be pushback, and there'll be controversy and all of that, but it doesn't matter. The truth is what makes the world, the truth is what redeems the world from hell, and that's the truth. And we saw plenty of hell over the last 100 years, you know, and we haven't learned a bloody thing from it. It's like, wake up, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. That's a start. And you got to understand that's a risk. But I have one more brief thing to say about that. So, you know, I said what I had to say back in September, and I'm sure that I could have done it better, and many people have told me how I could have done it better, although it didn't mean they would actually do it, but and you know, my job was at risk, serious risk, for about 2 months, and it destabilized my family, who've been very brave about this, so like, thumbs up to them, man. They've just stood by me. But here's the optimistic news, is the university has left me alone completely. I shook hands with the dean 2 weeks ago. We're on friendly terms. They don't want this to go any farther than it has already. The students were tremendously welcoming when I came back to teach in January. I haven't had a single negative incident at the university. And I've received thousands of letters from people all over the world, all of which have been in support. I've received 2 negative letters. That's it. 2. So the people have an inchoate longing to have the sort of thing that we're talking about articulated. And so don't be thinking you're alone. It's just that people can't talk, they're afraid to talk, or they don't know what to say. And those are real problems. So if you're reasonably articulate, like, start talking and sharpen yourself up. I mean, the enemy is a cloud. They're a cloud of gnats. They're only courageous in groups. They're only courageous in mobs. If you stand your ground and don't apologize and articulate things properly, they'll disperse around you like they're not even there. So most of it's illusion. So don't be afraid, but be afraid of the right thing. And the right thing you should be afraid of is not saying what you say, because that's the same as not being. And here you are, suffering away. You might as well be at the same time. At least then there's something to you. So.
What happens to you as you stroll merrily on your way through life? Well, what happens is that as you're moving from point A to point B, you encounter things. And people think that what they encounter are objects, but that's not the case. First of all, most of the things that you encounter, many of the things are actually other people, and they're not objects. They're too damn complex. And even apart from the social world, the things that you encounter aren't objects. They seem to be something more like tools or obstacles. And I don't mean that we see objects and turn them into tools or obstacles. I mean that we see tools and obstacles, because what happens is that when you array yourself towards a goal, then the world transforms itself into things that get in the way of that goal, and three things. Things that get in the way of the goal, those are things you don't like. Things that facilitate your movement towards the goal, those are things that you like, and irrelevant things. And mostly you want irrelevant things, because there's just too damn many things. So the category of irrelevant is one you really like. So most of everything is irrelevant if you have a good plan. A few things are good because they move you forward, and some other things are not so good. You want to go around the not so good things if you can manage them, unless you like to run head forth into like brick walls, which is not particularly, it's a learning experience, but I wouldn't repeat it too many times. You want the world to array itself as a set of, we could say, tools. Now, what happens is that you have this perceptual system that's mediated by dopamine. It's the same system that cocaine activates, or methamphetamine, or the drugs that people really like to take. And it's the dopaminergic system that responds with positive emotion to indications that you've encountered something that will facilitate your movement towards a goal. And that's really important to know,
Because people tend to think that they're happy because they achieve goals, and that's not true. What's true, because as soon as you achieve a goal, then you have a problem, which is what's the next goal. And that's actually a big problem. You encounter that as soon as you graduate from university, for example. That's right. I made this joke before. Graduation day, you're like king of the university hierarchy, undergraduate hierarchy. Day after, you're unemployed potential Starbucks employee, right? So it's like, so obviously the accomplishment per se as a source of reward is problematic, because when you accomplish, you run the frame to its end, and then you have the problem of needing a new frame. So that's a problem. But if what you're encountering instead are things that will move you along your way, it's like, hey, that's great, and that's where you get your positive motivation. And so that's really that's so much worth thinking about. You can think about that for a year, and that wouldn't even be enough to think about it, because here's what it means. It means, in some sense, that the Buddhists are right with their claim about Maya, M-A-Y-A, which means that people live in an illusion. And what they mean by that is, well, you have goal, whatever your goal is, and that goal gives relevance to the world. And you can change the relevance of the world in a snap just by changing your goal. You can do that. And so then you think, well, it's sort of an illusion because you can just change it. Now, you don't want to push that line of argumentation too far, because even if the specific point can be changed, the fact that you're in one of these frames cannot be changed. And so you have to be in a frame, although you get to pick the frame. So there's still an absolute there, which is that you have to be in a frame, and that is not a trivial absolute. It's a very major absolute. So then you think, okay, all of your positive emotion is going to be experienced in relationship to the goal. Well, then we think, well, you could use some positive emotion. It's a good thing. Positive emotion inhibits anxiety and disappointment and frustration and pain. It does all that. Technically, it does that. That's why a football player with a broken thumb who wants to score a touchdown can go out there and, play the football game, even though it's a kind of an arbitrary goal, right? It's like, really, you're going to go out there and like risk your hand to fire a pigskin through some poles? It's like, well, you can say the same sort of cynical thing about most of the things that people do, but you can't say the cynical thing about the fact that they have to do things. So you have a point, you have your aim, you have your ambition, and then that's what turns the world into a potentially positive place. And here's the kicker. This is so cool. The higher the aim, the more the positive emotion. So that's you think, well, why should I bother? Why should I bother doing something lofty and difficult? It's like, because it's worth it. That's why. Because the alternative is stupid suffering. Because really, because what happens is, like, you don't need a framework in order to suffer. You can just lay there day after day and suffer, right? That's easy. So that's the default condition. If you don't have a lofty ambition, then you suffer miserably. And the reason for that is life is really complex, short, finite, full of suffering, and beyond you. And so you can just lay there and think about that, and it's horrible. And so that's not helpful. It's just not useful. And so, people often say life is meaningless. It's like, no, it's not. That's wrong. Because if it was meaningless, that'd be easy. You could just sit there and do nothing, and it wouldn't matter, right? It'd be like you were like a lobotomized sheep. It's just irrelevant. But that isn't what happens. When people say that life has no meaning, that isn't what they mean. What they mean is, I'm suffering stupidly and intensely, and I don't know what to do about it. Well, the suffering is meaningful. It's just not the kind of meaning you want. So how do you get out of that? You note the baseline of suffering, which is very, 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 very high. And then you say to yourself, okay, I need to do something that justifies that. And that's not so easy, because the baseline for suffering is high. If you're going to make something of yourself, let's say, so that it's worthwhile to exist in the world, then you have to aim at something that's so well structured that you can say, yeah, earthquakes, cancer, death of my family, dissolution of my goals, ultimate futility of life, and the heat death of the universe. Hey, it doesn't matter, it's worth it. The empirical viewpoint is in some sense that what you know as a consequence of
sense data. And the problem with that proposition is that there is mystery embedded inside the axiomatic presupposition of sense data. So behavioral psychologists believe that animals, and they tried to model animal behavior using these a priori theory, the animal reacted reflexively to a stimulus, and so that's a deterministic machine hypothesis. And that always bothered me, partly because animals don't do that. So for example, if you train a rat to run down a maze, it'll learn how to run down the maze, and then if you bind the legs, back legs of the rat, and you put its rear end on a wheeled chariot, it will propel itself through the maze on the wheels. And obviously it didn't learn that reflexively because there aren't that many wheeled rats, and they just don't have that kind of experience. And so the rat's perfectly capable of modifying what it learned in this hypothetically deterministic manner to react to an entirely different set of challenges and come up with exactly the same solution. There was an old behaviorist joke that under controlled laboratory conditions, an animal will do exactly what it damn well pleases. And I like that very much. And the problem with the behaviorist theory of stimulus response was the axiomatic presupposition that the stimulus was given. That you just look at the world and there's the stimulus right in front of you, that takes no effort, and you merely respond reflexively to it. And that's so wrong that it's almost incalculable, because it turns out that perceiving the world is so complex that in some real sense, not only do we not know how we do it, but it looks impossible. And part of the reason that it's impossible, and this is again why empiricism is an incomplete theoretical account of the genesis of knowledge, is that there are literally, or close enough to literally, an infinite number of ways to look at anything. And that's because everything is not only complex in and of itself, at the microcosmic level, almost beyond imagination, but that everything is also situated in a context, which is actually a determining element of the nature of the thing, and the context, expanded enough, actually takes everything into account. And so that makes perception a very weird phenomenon. For another reason, I was always amused, for example, when I traveled with my family when I was young, on our summer vacations, we used to do things like get out and look at the border between Canada and the United States. And that's a very weird thing to do, because you can actually do it, and you can step across it, and people treat that as if it's magic in some sense, because part of us knows that that border is not there, right? It's not a part of the objective world, and yet, well, and yet it is, because there you are standing beside it. And then if you look at aerial views, you can see the farmers' fields end exactly where the border is. And so things like borders between countries inhabit this weird space between the objective and the subjective that's a magic space. And it actually turns out that almost everything we perceive has that degree of magicality about it. I've thought also about such things as people's proclivity to go to museums, maybe in Nashville, for example, or Memphis, to go look at Elvis Presley's guitar. And you think, well, what exactly are you looking at when you go look at Elvis Presley's guitar? Because first of all, it's a mass-produced guitar, and so why not just look at another guitar? And you think, well, that's not the same thing. It's like, well, why isn't it the same thing? Because it's not. And the reason is that the guitar is not merely something, and this is the thing you perceive, it's not merely something made up of the guitar atoms, let's say, and the guitar molecules. It's also an artifact that was embedded in a context across a period of time. And that embeddedness of that artifact is part of what you perceive when you see an artifact like a celebrity, something a celebrity owned, or the relic of a saint, let's say. And so, and you can say, well, that's all an overlay on top of perception, and that would be fine, except that's wrong. There's no data, so to speak, that support that viewpoint. That's not how perception works. Perception is unbelievably complicated. So we see regularities of being, and some of those, impediments and affordances is the technical term, we tend to perceive as objects. But we also see the possibilities of being. But the problem with that is that the world of objects, potentially relevant objects, and the world of possibility is vast beyond our comprehension. And so then we have another problem that emerges as a consequence of that, which is a key and signal problem, and the fact that it has been solved precipitously and carelessly, hastily, is actually the reason for the culture war that's raging today. And that is that we have to prioritize our perceptions. We have to prioritize our perceptions to get access to the sense data that hypothetically informs us. We have to see the world through a system of value. And why would I say a system of value? Well, a system of value is a system of priorities, right? Because to value something is to make it more important than other things that it's being compared to. And why do you need a hierarchy of perceptual priority in order to see? And the answer is, well, you can't see everything at once. And so you can only see one thing at a time. And which thing? And the answer is the thing you think is most important to see at that moment. And then the question is, well, and this is the question, why is that the most important thing to see at the moment? So imagine, this is true in the auditory domain, in the tactile domain, all sensory domains. And you think that perception is a passive action and that we act upon the consequences of our perception, and this is just not true at all. There's no level of the analysis of perception neurophysiologically where you can separate action from perception. So for example, when you're looking at the world, although you don't know this, your eyes are moving back and forth very, very quickly. They have to move. If they stop moving for more than 1/10 of a second, you go blind because you saturate the neurons that you're using to perceive so intensely with the repetitive stimulation that they just shut down. And so at a micro level, your eyes are vibrating like mad, and then there are saccades above that that are still unconscious, that are less rapid and wider. And then voluntarily, you have voluntary eye fields in the frontal cortex. You move your eyes voluntarily to point to what you want to see, and you do that because the center part of your vision is exceptionally high resolution. Each center vision foveal neuron is connected directly to 10,000 neurons in the primary visual cortex, and then each of those 10,000 is connected to another 10,000. It's very expensive neurophysiological real estate, and if all of your vision was as intensely high resolution as your fovea, which is a very small part of your retina, you'd have to have a brain like an alien.
She goes to where the most genuine evil is made manifest. Once inside, she made a deadly, poisonous apple. Well, why an apple? Well, an apple is the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? The apple is the thing that you incorporate that changes you. The apple is information. The apple is education. The apple is ideology. The apple is an idea rather than an artifact, right? That's what it's symbolic of. That's what it represents. And so the first kinds of poison or death that the pathological evil queen attempts to administer to Snow White are pretty straightforward and basic, right? They're appeals to her own vanity in the form of pathologization of her attractiveness. But this is a deeper form of poison, right? It's a poison that strikes right to the soul. Remember, it's the consuming of the apple that is the original sin that knocks Adam and Eve out of paradise. The poisoned apple is, what is it? It's pathological knowledge, right? I think it's exactly the same as the symbolic representation of the kind of evil doctrine that young women are fed by jealous, miserable, single, bitter, envious, resentful old women to knock them out of the mating game, partly to reduce competition and partly just out of self-destructive spite. A deadly poisonous apple. On the outside, it looked beautiful with red cheeks, right? Red cheeks. So the apple is red cheeks. It's emblematic of health itself, of flourishing health, right? If you wanted to be a healthy young woman, this is obviously the apple that you would eat. And that's exactly what young women are taught in today's universities, right? To pursue that path of career that now has left the prioritization of self-interest. It's not precisely career. The prioritization of narrow self-interest that compromises their youth and leaves 50% of women in the West childless at the age of 30. with the probability that 90% of them will regret that as the years pass by. Apple, beautiful with red cheeks. Anyone who saw it would be enticed to take a bite. Well, so this is propaganda in its most attractive form. It's like, well, if this is what you were offered, of course you'd take it. It sounds like you could have it all. Young women, you can have it all. Yeah, well, the question is, who's offering that particular apple, and what exactly is their motivation? We're just looking out for our younger sisters. It's like, yeah, maybe you're looking out for them, and maybe you're a manifestation of the evil queen whose fundamental motivation is to devour their liver and lungs. Yeah, well, thereafter she disguised herself as a peasant woman, a lowly woman, not a haughty beauty. Went to the dwarf's cottage and knocked on the door. Little Snow White looked and said, "I'm not allowed to have anyone inside. The 7 dwarfs have strictly forbidden me." "Well, if you don't want to let me in, I can't force you," answered the delightful peasant woman, right, emblematic of the oppressed working class. "I'll surely get rid of my apples in time. I have something that everyone wants, obviously, but let me give you one to test." Another manifestation of her evil making itself camouflaged in the guise of care and compassion. "No," said little Snow White, "I'm not allowed to take anything. The dwarfs won't let me." Yeah, well, you see, that's the sensible manifestation of the ordinary productive patriarchal impulse inside her, protecting herself from the depredations of predatory competitive females. "You're probably afraid." "Yeah," said the old woman. "Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. You eat the beautiful red half." However, the apple had been made with such cunning that only the red part was poisoned. When little Snow White saw the peasant woman eating her half, and when her desire to taste the apple grew stronger, she finally let the peasant woman give her the other half through the window. As soon as she took a bite of the apple, she fell to the ground and was dead. The queen rejoiced, went home and asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror answered, "You, my queen, are now the fairest of all." So the evil queen produced the pathological fruit of knowledge that dooms Snow White to death, administering it under the guise of compassion and caring in the form of a fruit so attractive that anyone with eyes would be tempted to take it. Brutal. "Now I can rest in peace," she said. "Once again, I'm the most beautiful in the land, and Snow White will remain dead this time." So, couldn't kill her with the bodice or the corset, couldn't kill her with the poisonous comb, but could certainly kill her with the consumption of the fatal apple. When the dwarfs came home from the mines that evening, they found little Snow White lying on the ground, and she was dead. They unlaced her and tried to find something poisonous in her hair, but nothing helped. They couldn't revive her. Okay, so what does that mean? The core element of the evil queen is so unbelievably pathological, so destructive, that ordinary, conscientious, diligent, protective masculinity is revealed as insufficient to redress the poison. Right. So that's why the queen, the prince has to come along. Right. It's only the higher order form of masculinity that's associated with true nobility and true courage that has the archetypal force, you might say, to provide true protection from the depredations of the evil queen. Well, Snow White is the helpmeet of the dwarfs, right? But there's no individualized relationship there. She hasn't moved beyond cooperation with the social patriarchy as such to the establishment of a personalized relationship with an individual and identifiable man, right? So she's still in the land of generic masculinity. And that's a hell of a lot better than the land of pathological evil queen destructive femininity, but it's not a relationship that's of sufficient depth and intensity to provide protection against the most fatal of feminine poisons. They couldn't revive her, so they laid her on a bier, and all 7 of them sat down beside it and wept for 3 whole days. Then they intended to bury her, but she still looked more alive than dead, and she still had such pretty red cheeks. So instead they made a glass coffin and placed her inside so that she could easily be seen. So they're worshiping her in a sense, even in her poisoned and near dead state. They still value her, right? So what does that mean? It means that the ordinary men apprehending an attractive young woman who has been poisoned by the teachings of the evil queen still hope in their soul for the revivification of her spirit, but are unable to match the machinations of the evil queen themselves. Right, so they stand back and observe, and that's all they can do. They wrote her name on the coffin in gold letters, showing how much they value her, and added the family name. One of the dwarfs remained at home every day to keep watch over her. So Snow White lay in the coffin for a long, long time. Right, so now that's failure to launch. Now she's in a state of suspended animation because of her poison knowledge, because of her receipt of the poisoned apple. She is mimicking life, but is unconscious and unable to fully participate.
And I would say you don't just have to face the reality of unjust suffering and death in your life. You have to face the reality of hell. And you might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, do you believe in Nazi Germany? You know, do you believe in the Stalinist Soviet Union or Maoist China or Cambodia? That's hell. And you can assess that more deeply. You could say, well, that's not even hell. That's not as precise a formulation of hell as you might be able to conceptualize. Hell is actually participation in the process that led to the establishment of those countries. And that's something that human beings do. And the fact that we do that is something we have to face. And maybe that's even worse than death. And I think you can make a case for that. I really do. I think there are things in life that are worse than death. There are things in life that are worse than unjust suffering and death. And the things that lead to hell are worse. And you might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. It's like, yeah, you do, as a matter of fact, because you're going to face those things too. And you're going to face that when you face your own malevolence, which you will, and you're going to face that when you face the malevolence of others, including the mob. And some of that's just death and tragedy, and some of it is something far darker and deeper than that. And so, yeah, you face that. And so that's kind of interesting. And then you might think, well, how should you face that? And that's where Tammy's story is relevant. It's like, well, so she went and swam with the sharks. And I wasn't very happy about that because our life has been adventurous enough. I thought, do you really need to go swim with the sharks? And the answer seemed to be, well, that would be an adventure. And, you know, I don't interfere with her when she's having an adventure. She's going to go have an adventure. It's far be it for me to interfere. And then she told me, you know, that you had to look the shark in the eye or it would think you're prey. Think, well, what do you have to look in the eye so you're not prey? And, you know, human beings have been trying to figure that out for a long time because we're strange animals because we're predators, but we're also prey. And so I guess at any moment you're sort of deciding, well, are you a predator? Are you the thing that's on top or are you prey? And you're prey if you turn tail and run. And there's a psychological truth there, like a deep psychological truth. And it seems to be something like if you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you Imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation. That changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor, which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. Are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure? Regardless of its scope, and the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal, because it's realistic. It's not naive at all. It says, look, man, trouble's coming your way, and it's real. And yet it's possible that you could confront that and still do good in the deepest sense. It's like, well, that's quite something. It would be really quite something if that's true. And one of the preconditions of that would be faith, I suppose. And in some sense, that's what Tammy was manifesting when she went down and swam with the sharks. Faith that if she looked the bloody predator in the eye, that would solve the problem. And then you think too, well, could it be any other way? It's like, well, we have all these problems in our lives, and we could think there's two possible ways of approaching those problems. One would be we just ignore them in the hopes they would what? Go away? Well, and no one thinks that's, no one who isn't a child thinks that, and very few children. Nobody believes that. We know perfectly well that if you got to face something, man, you better face it. And if you're going to face it, that's probably the best pathway forward. And then you might think, well, what does that mean ultimately? And it might mean something like, face it, as deeply as you possibly can and as voluntarily as you possibly can. And there's an element of faith in that, because you have to put yourself on the line. But you're kind of stuck with that anyways. You know, that's the rub. But you know, so that's one thing that interests people, how to do something successfully. But a lot of what people talk about is something different, which is, I was trying to get from point A to B and it didn't work, and now I'm at a place where it didn't work. And so it's a problem, right? It's like, the world's opened up around me, I don't know what to do. And the reason you talk to people about that is because they have brains. And so do you, and you might as well have two brains working on the problem if you can. And if you're reciprocal, you know, you're in trouble, you come to me and we talk it out, and maybe I can help. And then, because we're playing a iterative game, now you owe me a favor. Now, you know, I'm not going to be too restrictive about that, but you know, socially intelligent people are reciprocal. And Ben Franklin once said, you're new in a neighborhood, what should you do to get integrated? He said, ask a neighbor for a favor. A small favor. It's right, like, don't. Will you build me a new house? It's like, no, that's not going to work. But, you know, would you watch here's my dog's on the lawn, would you watch him for 2 minutes while I run down to the corner store? It's like, okay, they can do that. Well, why would you do that? Well, it opens up the possibility of reciprocal exchange. It's very, very smart, because now they can ask you for a favor. So you get the trade thing going. And people who are highly social are really good at identifying and maintaining reciprocal obligations. So we use each other as problem-solving resources. And a lot of our communication is exactly that. And so basically the story you're telling isn't, I was at point A and I went to point B and everything worked. The story is this instead. It's half of this. Okay, I was at point A, that's the top left-hand corner. I was at point A and I was going to point B, but something didn't work. And then things collapsed, you know, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the severity of the event, you know, and the closeness of your friendship. Say you're telling this story. You're not going to tell catastrophic stories to someone on a bus that you just sat down beside, unless you have a mental illness. And sometimes, well, really, it's the truth. Sometimes you'll sit down on a bus, and someone who has a mental illness will come and sit beside you, and they will immediately tell you horrible things about their life. And the reason for that is they have to. They don't have anyone to talk to. They can't sort out their brains. They're so desperate. They're so ruined. They're in chaos. They're so ruined that the proclivity to proclaim the chaos absolutely overwhelms them. And you just can't deal with someone like that most of the time, because the magnitude of the problem they're facing you with is way beyond your capacity to solve. So it's just awkward. It's not good. Anyways, you say, I was going from point A to point B, didn't work. Now I don't know where I am, I don't know where I'm going, and I'm lost. And you say, well, in my experience when I was in a situation like this, I did this, and I know someone else who in that situation did this, and maybe you could try those. Or maybe you just shut up, and you let the person talk. And that's often extremely useful, and the reason you do that is because they're thinking. Because people think they think, but they don't. They talk. Thinking is hard, right? It's a very complex, abstract, cognitive operation. And I don't think that there are many more people who can think than there are people who can really read. And that's probably 2 to 5% of the population at most. And so most of the way that people deal with that is that they talk. And that's their thinking. And so they have some ideas about what might be going on, but they're mixed and muddy. So they're basically throwing out these ideas. You know, did this happen? Is he like this? Is she like that? It's like, did I do this? It's like, and then they watch you, and you know, if you're nodding about one, they think, oh well, you know, that seems plausible, and they lay out another, and you go, you don't even notice, and they think, no, that's off the table. I didn't think that was a very good idea, but now I've got some social, what do you call it, validation, and soon they talk it out, and instead of having 60 vaguely defined problems, now they have like 5 fairly tightly defined problems. They're feeling a lot better about that, right? Because it's 5 snakes instead of 60. And maybe they can deal with 5 snakes. So you've already helped them a whole bunch just by listening. You know, and then maybe you can be an active listener, and they lay out their story, and you say, well, you said something here that doesn't make any sense with this thing that you said, so, you know, how would you reconcile those? And, you know, it's this dialectical process. And so the person collapses into chaos, and they come and tell you about it, and then you rescue them, if you can, out of the chaos, and then they pop back up the other side.
You know, not everybody is equipped to or interested in engaging in high-level discussion of abstract and creative ideas. You know, you hear this idea that everyone's creative. That's a lie. It's as straightforward as that. True creativity is very, very rare. And so, and if you happen to be a creative person, or if you happen to be someone who's profoundly interested in ideas, you are in a pronounced minority, just as you are if you happen to be extremely extroverted or extremely agreeable or extremely conscientious. These are minority issues, and what you do is you find like-minded people who are capable of engaging that. You know, heavyweight weightlifters compete with heavyweight weightlifters for a reason, and everyone thinks that's fine, and the same thing applies to intellectual and creative endeavors. So what you do is you try to find a community where that's the nature of the community, and you likely have to find a relationship like that as well, you know. So I don't think so. I think what contributes to the siloing is the arrogance that goes along with it, because if you can be interested in ideas and you can be creative, well, that's the arrogance of the intellect, right? That's the thing the Catholic Church had warned about for centuries, is the arrogance of the intellect. So because if you're wise as well as smart, and there is no relationship between being smart and being wise, they are not the same thing. There's no quick pathway from smart to wise. And many of the people who I've known who were very wise well, some of them were intellectually impaired and were still wise, you know. So it's the arrogance that brings up the block. And I see this, for example, happening in the United States in particular, because the last time I went down there, for example, I had friends down there, and some of those friends are very, very smart people, and some of them were talking about the Trump voters, and they were talking about the Trump voters with contempt. And I thought, you better watch that, because that's 50% of the damn population. And it might be convenient to think that they're stupid and beneath you, but it's not conducive to a civil state, and there's no evidence that it's true, because there isn't a straight line between intelligent and wise. And so I think that if your character is developed and you're intelligent, you can have your siloed creative community, but you develop enough wisdom so that you can see all the things that people can do that are of high ethical utility, that are outside the intellectual domain. You know, and I think that's why in the New Testament, I think that's why Christ is a carpenter. Right? Because, well, first of all, a carpenter is one of those jobs that when you're dishonest, it manifests itself immediately, because what you build falls down. And so if you're an honest carpenter, you build a good house. So that there's a nice metaphor there. But it's also a warning, in some sense, against the equation of intellectual brilliance with moral superiority. And so if the intellects would drop their moral superiority, and fat chance there is of that, then the divide between the working class, say, and the elite would resolve. And there's every reason to have respect for decent working class people. I mean, it's on their labor, as the left-wingers at least hypothetically agree, that the entire edifice of the culture is resting. So you can have your cake and eat it too, but you have to not assume that your niche makes you superior. And it's very difficult for smart people, especially smart. There's this scene in Nietzsche's, it's in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where Zarathustra, the prophet, comes down from the mountain, and he comes into a public square, and there's this crowd around this little midget who's only about this high, who has a gigantic ear, and everyone is marveling at him. Well, that's what the modern intellect is like. It's a midget with a giant, well, mouth generally, not an ear. And the being is underdeveloped, but the intellect is hyper activated, and it makes the person extraordinarily unbalanced. And it's partly because they can't compete outside the intellectual realm, and that makes them very bitter, because they tend to think, well, God, I'm so smart, everything should just come to me. It's like, sorry, that's not how the world works. And it also that attitude is immediately evident to people that they're talking to when they talk in the manner that they talk, if they are arrogant intellectuals of that sort. You see that in The Simpsons did a good job of that with Comic Book Guy, right? I mean, he completely useless in every possible dimension with an IQ of about 160. And it's very annoying to people who have an IQ of 160 that they can also be completely useless. But it happens a lot.
So